We're going to go about this different. You can get excited about fiber in a completely different way than your grandma gets excited about her Metamucil. All right, this is a completely different ball game. And I'm here with Simon Hill. And when you talk about fiber, sometimes it gets people a little bit defensive because they automatically assume that you're only going down this, plants are great, meat is bad kind of discussion. And I tend to look at fiber from a little bit of a performance perspective. Not that that's necessarily how everyone should look at it, but I'm looking at optimization. And if the data is so strong, then it's in that favor and I go with it. And the data with fiber is very, very, very strong, whether you are plant-based, whether you are eating meat, whether you're, green, black, purple, brown, whatever. So what are 5 reasons we should never ever be skimping on fiber? And today's video is sponsored by Seed. If you're worried about your gut microbiome, you're trying to make some changes, but ultimately if you're trying to add carbohydrates back into your diet after doing low carb for a long time, very important you take care of your microbiome. So that link down below saves you 25% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic, which has a prebiotic and a probiotic in one capsule. So a capsule inside of a capsule. Super interesting technology. Very, very cool to check out. So they also fund a lot of microbiome research. So they put their money where their mouth is. A lot of the proceeds go back into research because we're trying to understand what these little microbes in our gut do and how important they are. So anyhow, that makes a big difference. Made a big difference for me. I don't usually recommend probiotics because a lot of them are garbage, but this one's definitely worth a shot. So that link down below is in the top line of the description for Seed.
Well, the first one is that a low fiber diet seems to shorten our lifespan. And there is quite strong data looking at this. Very big meta-analysis in the Lancet 2020, Andrew Reynolds, great scientist, pulled together a ton of data from observational studies and clinical trials and looked at how is fiber associated with lifespan, how is it associated with colorectal cancer, how is it associated with type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and breast cancer. And consistently across the board, as fiber intake goes up to 25 to 29 grams, I think was the range that they used, when you're comparing that intake to lower intake, so the average American fiber intake, I think is 15 or 16 grams a day, if it's similar to Australia. When you're comparing 24 to 29 grams, there is significantly lower risk in those higher fiber consumers for lifespan, for total mortality, for all those diseases that I mentioned. So the first thing is, if we're consuming a low fiber diet, we're increasing our risk of disease and perhaps shortening our life.
And the data with that tends to parallel the gut diversity data, which is quite interesting too.
Right.
And there's probably an intersect point at some degree. Like with fiber, there are a couple different nuancy things you could pick apart there. With fiber, on one hand, arguably, when you're increasing fiber, you're probably increasing polyphenol intake, other phenolic compounds, flavonoids, a number of different things, which I'm sure have a direct and or indirect effect on longevity. But a lot of the benefit that we're probably seeing there is the diversity of the microbiome, which I think is another important point to talk about. It can be its own reason, right, but also just that in and of itself, there are direct correlations there between longevity, gut diversity, especially as people start getting older, the flexibility of the gut microbiome, which is quite interesting. I don't know if you've seen some of that data, where the older that someone gets, like even into their 90s, it becomes less about the gut diversity and more about how individualized their microbiome is. So in essence, almost the flexibility and the variability of their microbiome, which indicates a healthy gut throughout the entirety of their life.
Right.
So like the ability for that gut microbiome to change and modulate. A lot of people that watch this channel might know of heart rate variability, understanding like how flexible your heart can be under stress, right? Now we're starting to see the microbiome's kind of the same way.
And from an evolutionary point of view, that makes sense.
Yep.
Like why have a microbiome? It allowed us to quickly adapt to a changing environment. We were outsourcing various functions to the microbiome in order to survive. That's the very nature of this symbiotic relationship that exists. I should add on that first study that I mentioned, and this is a really important point, it's a dose-response relationship. So you see a linear relationship I mentioned 24 to 29 grams, but it looks like the benefits keep going beyond that, which is a really interesting thing to kind of consider when you think about what are the recommendations today from the government. And, I think many out there would say it's probably better to target somewhere between 30 and 50 grams, depending on what you can tolerate. And toleration of some of these foods is an important thing that maybe we can discuss at some point.
Okay, so number one, potential increase in lifespan. Number two, what would you say that is?
Satiety is a big one. We know that fiber affects satiety in a number of ways. One main one is kind of the ileal brake. It's slowing down gastric emptying. Mm-hmm. So the rate at which foods are moving through the upper part of the gastrointestinal tract, it slows that down and gives you a greater sense of fullness with a meal, which has been shown in several studies to reduce total energy intake when you can increase fiber intake. For example, in a morning meal, people tend to consume a little bit less calories over the day. So that's one mechanism that fiber affects satiety. It's also directly affecting the release of certain hormones. We know that GLP-1, for example, is increased following fiber consumption. Now, I think there's an idea out there that it's only fiber that increases GLP-1, but it's not. It's also fats can increase GLP-1 and protein, but fiber significantly increases GLP-1 in the large intestine, and it's through the fermentable components of carbohydrates. So indigestible carbohydrates pass through to the large intestine. Some of these are soluble, and it's the microbiome that metabolizes them and produces these end products, short-chain fatty acids. So people may have heard of butyrate or propionate or acetate, for example. And it's these short-chain fatty acids that can increase this hormone GLP-1. And the increase in GLP-1 directly affects satiety. It reduces your hunger. The mechanisms are not completely understood, but it seems to affect the reward centers of the brain. Among other things, it affects insulin secretion. It actually improves beta cell function, interestingly. So that's probably the second, high level, is that fiber seems to help people feel more full on less calories. And that's really important in an environment, an obesogenic environment, where we're surrounded by low fiber foods that are low water, low fiber, low protein, ultra processed foods. If we think about those foods that make up 60% of the average American's diet, fiber is arguably a big reason, or lack of fiber is a big reason. And I'm not suggesting it's just fiber, because there's many components of those foods that lead to overconsumption. But our fiber deplete diets are certainly probably contributing to the excessive calorie intake, which then, as you know, is driving metabolic disease.
Well, and with this, people tend to think that it's very difficult to get that robust amount of fiber because, I'm not going to eat that many vegetables and things like that. And I've always taken a different approach. Like, I always try to go bang for the buck with my fiber, because I realize the impact on the microbiome for me is what I'm really after more than anything. And when you talk GLP-1, I'm sure you've heard of semaglutide, Ozempic, GLP-1 receptor agonists, which are all the rage right now. That is a pharmaceutical way to act upon and ultimately release more GLP-1 and also just bind to that receptor. Essentially, you're doing this at a smaller scale with fiber. Yeah. And it's not because the fiber creating bulk in your stomach or bulk in your intestines. That's a strong misnomer, although that does happen. That's only a portion of why you are satiated after you have fiber. There's a downstream effect that comes as a result of a diverse microbiome and the effect on GLP-1 there. So with that, even things like psyllium, things like flax, things like small, even chia, where you don't need much, but the sheer soluble aspect of it makes it a very fermentable piece. Or things like a resistant starch, a potato that's been heated and cooled, a sweet potato that's naturally high in resistant starch, where it's resistant to digestion and it's creating more fodder for the bacteria to feed on. So with that, okay, so we've got longevity, we've got satiety, which could probably dovetail into even body composition if you wanted to. But what would you say number 3 is?
I think I would say inflammation. And this can go both ways. But we know inflammation is a hallmark feature of many different types of chronic diseases. Chronic inflammation I'm talking about here, of course. And this can go one or two ways. In some people, and you may have heard this before, you may have had this feedback, when people add fiber to their diet, they actually can have an increase in inflammation. And other people that can have a decrease. And there was a really interesting study out of Stanford. This came out of the Sonnenberg's lab. And they were specifically looking at how does fiber and fermented foods, I'm not sure if you've seen this study, how do fiber and fermented foods affect inflammatory markers? And how do they modulate the microbiome? Their hypothesis was that fiber will modulate the microbiome significantly and lead to lower inflammation. Interestingly, and this was a very well done study, I believe that each arm of the study was about 10 weeks long. And along the way, they're taking stool samples and measuring inflammatory markers, and not just a handful, they measured like 200 different inflammatory markers, proteins. And what they saw was across the board, fermented foods lowered inflammation across the board, right? Which was a really big tick for fermented foods, actually. So it's a great reason for people to kind of consider adding fermented foods to their diet to help encourage a healthy microbiome and lower inflammation. But what they saw on the fiber side, coming back to what we're talking about here, was super interesting. So some subjects, when they increased fiber from 20 grams to 40, that was the increase that they did in this study. They ramped them up from 20 to 40. Some subjects experienced an increase in inflammation. They didn't tolerate that fiber very well. And others tolerated it much better and had a reduction there was a signal, reduction in certain inflammatory markers. So they were really interested in the personalized individual response there and what could maybe explain that. And that intrigued me because that's feedback I get. I get a lot of people messaging me saying, hey, I want to eat more fiber, but when I am increasing fiber in my diet, I don't feel that great. So they went back and looked at, is there something about these people that's different between those who responded well to fiber and those that didn't? And they noticed that those who didn't tolerate fiber very well had very low baseline microbiome diversity. So their microbiome had been disrupted perhaps previously earlier in their life. There could be a number of reasons. It could be antibiotic overuse. It could be years of having a very heavily refined diet that's low in fiber. There could be many reasons that explain that. But that's now created a hypothesis for a future study that they're looking at doing, which is before increasing someone's fiber intake, can they do an intervention like adding fermented foods or a probiotic? Is there a way of increasing their diversity first before dialing up their fiber intake? So the jury's kind of a little bit out in terms of what's the best way of going about that. I think I'm kind of currently, my hypothesis is that two things. One is they probably ramped those people up too quickly. They needed to go slower. So 20 to 40 grams over that period was a little bit too quick. And so had they titrated up the consumption of fiber much slower, I think the microbiome would have adjusted and they might not have seen that increase in inflammation.
Yeah, how long was the length of time that they measured this over?
It was a 10-week.
Yeah.
10-week study.
Yeah, I mean, if you just throw someone over a couple of months and start adding a bunch of fiber, that's
They did a 6-week ramp, 6-week ramp going in, and then I believe a 10-week. Might have been a 4-week ramp, but I think over a longer period, they might have seen different results.
Yeah, I mean, because if you look, most of the data that's on the microbiome is usually looking at 6 months plus, increases or changes in the microbiome to really ascertain like something that's more concrete. So you really need to probably hold that for 6 months to see any noticeable change. I shouldn't say noticeable change, but a monumental change in the microbiome that would have these other downstream effects, right? So there's probably these compensatory effects that are happening. Like all of a sudden you're taking in fiber, that's actually stress on your body at first because you don't know how to deal with it. It's just like if you were to take someone that was doing carnivore and give them a stalk of asparagus, they're probably going to inflame. And the argument would probably be that, well, asparagus inflames me, I should never eat asparagus. Because their microbiome is just so different. I can't speak to whether it's diverse or not, or whether it's, whatever. Point is this is a completely foreign food to this entire biome at that point in time. So with that, okay, so now we've got longevity, we've got satiety, we've got inflammation. What's next?
Just one more piece on that,
Sure.
Because you mentioned the carnivore diet. There is one interesting study that looked at an animal-based carnivore diet versus a plant-based diet and looking at the microbiome. And this came out of David Lawrence's lab, and this was published in Nature in 2014, if anyone wants to look it up. But they did notice on the animal-based diet, subjects had an increase in inflammatory bacteria. So again, this feeds into that inflammation conversation. Those that were eating that plant-based high-fiber diet didn't have that increase in inflammatory bacteria.
Interesting. How long was that over?
You're testing me here. It's been a while since I've looked at that study, but I'm not sure on the duration. It was a fairly short intervention, and one, I guess, limitation, a caveat just to put out there is that the animal-based diet, I think the quality could have been a bit better. It was decent, but there was some processed meats in there as well. Yeah. So that makes it a little bit hard to interpret. But I hope that going forward, there are more researchers that are interested in starting to look at these different dietary patterns and the microbiome.
No, it would be very interesting because there's an impact of saturated fat on the microbiome as well. There's impacts of even collagen as a polypeptide and the impact on the microbiome. If someone is doing what I would consider a more well-crafted carnivore diet, you're paying attention to those kinds of things because collagen is a polypeptide and in some cases could be argued as a fiber, as a polypeptide, which does make a difference. And I know from the ketogenic studies, not from the carnivore specifically, that in the first 3 months, you see a reduction in the diversity of the microbiome. And then after 6 months, you see a rebalancing and it's back to baseline. So it all depends on how quickly I can't speak for carnivore because I just don't know. But I know with keto, you're having typically a reduction in fiber when people first go on keto, which if you're doing low carb or keto, I don't suggest you reduce your fiber. I think if anything, increase it as you go into it, but that's a different point. Right. So typically the mainstream, someone will go keto, they'll reduce their fiber and then their microbiome adjusts. And then over time, it seems to kind of come back down again. And over time, I think it comes back down probably because people get comfortable on a ketogenic diet, start leaning into the keto processed foods. They start having less of the vegetables. They start going more into just what's sustainable for them, which unfortunately ends up just becoming, again, it does come back to processed meats. It does come back to processed cheeses. And they start losing that diversity again. So I think with a low carb diet, again, another discussion for another day, it can be done, not necessarily with carnivore, but you absolutely can add these fibers in on a lower carb diet and see this rebalancing.
Have you heard of the gut microbiome project?
No.
So this was super interesting. I think this is just a great take-home message for people who are thinking about microbiome diversity. They looked at 10,000 plus stool samples and then received information on how all these people were eating as well. And so they were interested in the relationship between someone's dietary pattern and the diversity. And they had this huge sample size. And it wasn't the dietary label. It wasn't whether someone was vegan or someone was vegetarian or someone was an omnivore that was associated with the diversity. It was the diversity, the number of plants in their diet. Anyone could achieve that microbiome diversity if they had enough unique plants in their diet. I think this is a really important take-home point. So they noticed people that had 10 or fewer plants in a week, unique plants, had way less diversity in their microbiome than people who had 30 or more. And that includes like herbs and spices and nuts and seeds. All of those are considered as unique plants, right? So, because it can seem a little bit of a daunting task to get to 30 unique plants. It's actually a fun challenge to write down over the week and see where you land. But I think that's really interesting, and it speaks to the fact that the bacteria in our colon, there are all of these different species, and they kind of have different taste buds. Some of them enjoy the fiber in certain plant foods or prebiotics in certain plant foods. Some enjoy the prebiotics in different plant foods. And that's why this diversity of plant foods seems to lead to this diversity in the microbiome. And the key point being is that it seems that when you have that diversity in the microbiome, it's rewarding you. It's almost like your own little chemist or pharmacy just dispensing drug-like molecules, metabolites, these postbiotics that then enter the bloodstream. And it's only been the last 5 or 10 years that scientists, and there's so much more to explore there, it's very, very, very early, that scientists have even understood that. It was thought 10, 15 years ago, for example, that polyphenols, it was thought that polyphenols were ingested, come into the small intestine and were absorbed, right? Turns out only 5% of polyphenols that we consume are absorbed in the small intestine. 95% pass through to the large intestine and are metabolized by our bacteria. Polyphenols are a prebiotic, most of them. So prebiotic meaning food for bacteria, which then produces a compound which has a healthful effect. Prebiotic is an umbrella term which encompasses polyphenols, resistant starch. So you can get a lot of that in legumes and cooked and cooled potatoes. You can also get supplements like green banana resistant starch as a supplement. There's some potato supplements as well. And prebiotic fiber. Polyphenols, resistant starch, prebiotic fiber collectively are prebiotics. And when we're eating a diverse diet with a lot of these different plant foods, from nuts and seeds and fruits and vegetables and legumes and herbs and spices, we are nourishing more of these species, and they're rewarding us with these metabolites.
That is wild. I mean, that makes so much sense. I mean, and I love when we circle this back to whether you are eating 300 grams of protein from chicken and steak per day, or whether you're eating 200 grams of protein from, natto and tempeh. At the end of the day, like, the fiber is a supplemental aspect that can be plug and played into anything. Right. And it's just that diversity that matters. Diversity obviously is going to cover a lot of different things outside of just the 5 that we're talking about, but we've covered 3. Mm-hmm. What would you say the 4th one is?
I've seen some interesting research looking at, and this kind of extends on what we just mentioned about polyphenols, but I think it's interesting for people to understand the link between the microbiome and the mind. So there's a bunch of different trials that have looked at, and I saw you did a video recently on acai berries. Mm-hmm. I thought that was great. Yeah. Very rich in antioxidants, polyphenols. The studies that I'm familiar with that have looked at polyphenols and cognition have looked at blueberry extracts, so nowhere near the polyphenol content of the acai berries, but still pretty high. They're rich in anthocyanins, mm-hmm. type of polyphenol. And these studies have in kids and adults have shown that the acute consumption of these blueberry extracts or blueberries in a smoothie have improved cognitive performance in the hours afterwards. So in the sort of 4 to 6 hour window afterwards. And that's been replicated a number of times in different trials now. And so one of the hypotheses, and there are some studies that have measured this, is that the anthocyanins are being metabolized by the microbiome. The microbiome is producing postbiotics. As I mentioned before, we can consider these as sort of drug-like molecules that are entering the bloodstream. And they've been able to track some of these different compounds. And those compounds are actually circulating for like up to 24, 48 hours after the consumption of blueberries. It's amazing. And some of them seem to be crossing blood-brain barrier, increasing blood flow to the brain, increasing brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so they're starting to try and piece together the actual mechanisms that can explain how does the acute consumption of blueberries affect cognition, and it was memory retention, those sorts of things. But I think that's another kind of interesting connection and reason for us to have more of these plant foods in our diet that are really rich in polyphenols. And polyphenols is a very diverse class. Anthocyanins is just one. There is hundreds, if not thousands, of these compounds in our food.
I'm going to put you on the spot. So Paul Saladino, do you think, in your opinion, the reason that he feels so much better adding fruit into his prior carnivore meat-only diet is a result of the carbohydrates? Or is it a result of the fact that he might be altering his microbiome and these polyphenols are impacting him? Pure theory, but what do you think?
Yeah, I had to chuckle. I met him the other day and we laughed about that, about his addition of fruit back into his diet. We actually laughed and said if he and I were to go and have a meal together, it would be a bowl of fruit. But I mean, it's incredibly hard to tease out. But he doesn't have a problem with polyphenols from the sound of it, which was kind of refreshing for me to hear. But is it the polyphenols? Is it the fiber? It's probably both.
Or is it the carbohydrates in general?
Right, and definitely I think the carbohydrates.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. Well, if we touch on, I just wanted a soundbite there for Instagram, by the way. That's a perfect one. Anyway, the idea of postbiotics, I just want to touch on something that is what I call blue sky territory. This is so interesting. If we can hypothetically imagine that there could be 1,000 compounds in a blueberry, this is purely hypothetical, but if we could imagine there's 1,000 compounds that we just can never even extract unless we have a diverse microbiome, these postbiotics. We've seen this with pomegranates and urolithin A, so we know it's a thing, where there are compounds that some people can extract out of foods that other people cannot, and it seems to come back to the diversity of the gut in many ways. That, for me, just makes me all the more interested in having a diverse microbiome. If I have a diverse microbiome and I can potentially extract these 1,000 compounds that we've never heard of before, we didn't know existed, it could be 1 million, it could be 1 billion, that's a no-brainer to me. That is total blue sky territory where there's only upside. There's only upside to increasing your gut diversity, because now when I eat that blueberry, I'm getting 1,000 times the benefit than that person is, right? Not that it's a race or a game or a challenge, but I want as much benefit extracted out of every morsel of calorie that I get that I possibly can.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is actually a really good compass for people when they're in the grocery store. So if you walk into the grocery store or you're writing your shopping list, if you just pause and think, I'm not just eating for myself here. I'm eating for two. I'm eating for, or more than two. There's 38 trillion of these guys down in the column. But you're eating for yourself, but you're also eating for your microbes, and you need to support them. And if you take that into the grocery store when you're writing the grocery list, all of a sudden the ultra processed packaged foods are no longer as enticing, because they're devoid of fiber. They're low in polyphenols and resistant starch. And so each time you're eating those, you're giving up an opportunity that could be to nourish the microbiome, which is then rewarding you in all these ways that we're talking about.
Yeah, and it's so indirect, it's hard for a lot of people to fathom. I was filming with Dr. Daniel Amen, the double board certified psychiatrist, earlier this week, and he said something that was so great. He's like, every time that I go into the grocery store, I have a 3-second rule, and I ask myself the question when I look at something, does this food love me back? So I might love this food, but does this food love me back? And that's the question that he asks himself. And I thought that was very powerful, because that 3-second little gap that you can give yourself, extending that, it's almost like a pragmatic way. Does this food love my gut? Does this, the hard part is it's so difficult because we don't feel our gut immediately, right? It's a delayed effect, and we can only have a stimulus sort of Pavlovian response to how we feel from a food in that moment, and that's what makes it very difficult, which is exactly why this education is so important. Okay, with that, what would you say number 5?
There's a few different ways I could go here. There's so many different benefits of fiber. Let's talk about cholesterol. I think that's important.
Yeah.
I know that's maybe a little bit controversial.
I don't think it's as controversial when you come down to fiber's effect on it. I think the data's quite strong there.
Yeah, so we know that fiber will have an effect on your cholesterol levels, and that to varying degrees. And the mechanism, there are a few different mechanisms, but one is fiber will increase the amount of bile that you excrete. And bile is produced to help you absorb fats in your diet, in your small intestine. But to produce bile, our liver uses cholesterol. And so when you're excreting more bile, what does the body have to do? It actually has to produce more bile. And to do that, it pulls cholesterol out of the circulation to do it. So that's the mechanism by which it lowers our cholesterol levels. And you'll get a small but still significant reduction. So if someone has elevated ApoB and they're looking at ways in their diet, so how can you modulate your diet to shift ApoB into a favorable direction? Well, there are a few things. Number one, most impactful thing by far is what type of fats are you eating? Can you eat less saturated fat and more unsaturated fats? We know that that swap will have the biggest effect. Number two is dietary cholesterol, but this is very dependent on your genes. So about 1 in 5 people are a hyperabsorber, where dietary cholesterol affects them much more than 4 out of 5 people. And number 3 after that would be looking at your fiber intake. And when you start to stack these things on top of each other, and there's a sort of dietary intervention called the portfolio diet, I'm not sure if you've seen it. Mm-hmm. And they did exactly this. People can look it up. They had a series of different dietary swaps, and they focused more on what you're adding to your diet, not what you're removing so much. But by virtue of adding foods, it kind of crowds out the other ones. And when you stack up those changes of changing the fat profile of the diet, lowering the dietary cholesterol, increasing fiber, it's about a 30% reduction in LDL cholesterol. Which is quite significant, right? So if someone was looking at how can they lower their LDL cholesterol or ApoB through lifestyle, then certainly thinking about fiber, giving attention to fiber is another part of the diet that's important.
And being able to modulate that in association with your fat intake, right? If being self-aware, if you're consuming more saturated fat, then perhaps adding more fiber is only going to make things better, right? Reduce the potential risk, especially if you don't know, ApoB or anything like that for yourself. I think once again, you only end up on positive, right?
There's not many downsides to adding more fiber to the diet other than the adjustment period, which goes back to what we spoke about earlier, where some people, it's like going to the gym. If you haven't been to the gym for a long time and you go in and smash yourself on day one, you could injure yourself, but you're going to be really sore, right, in the days to come. But as you get more conditioned to working out over time, it doesn't become easier, but your body is adapting to it, and you grow stronger. And so it's similar with our gut. If we're going to increase fiber in the diet, plant diversity, but we've had years or decades of a low fiber diet, we need to approach it in the same way. Go in and sort of progressively overload and do it over a longer period of time, and I think people will get better results.
I agree. Well, Simon, where can everyone find you, man?
Podcast, The Proof, Twitter, The Proof, and Instagram @Simon Hill.
Well, as always, keep it locked in here on the channel. And Simon, thanks, my man.
Thanks.